This is Donbass, January 2026, a stretch of land once shaken by tank tracks and artillery, now plunged into an eerie silence. On the reconnaissance screens, the faint glowing dots around Lyman and Kreminna are not Russian units on patrol, much less formations preparing to assault. They stand still, motionless, as if someone had pulled the plug on a war machine once hailed as unstoppable. No winter storm, no extreme frost is powerful enough to freeze an entire military system. Yet in Donbass right now, Russian armored convoys are not moving. Supply lines are quiet. The roads that were once Moscow's logistical lifelines have become dark zones no one dares enter. This is not happening because of the weather or because of cautious strategy. It is happening because the sky has become the territory of an invisible hunter, a name every Russian officer knows well but doesn't want to mention. Lasar's group, the combat UAV unit of the National Guard of Ukraine. In the final weeks of 2025, Ukrainian UAV activity surged dramatically across the entire northern Donetsk Oblast, and what it created was not just material damage. It created fear. Lasar doesn't just destroy tanks, armored vehicles, or supply convoys. They destroy freedom of movement, the absolute advantage the Russian army once considered unbeatable. The result is that Donbass has fallen silent, not because of peace, but because an entire army is trying not to be seen. In war, there are many forms of failure, but failure out of fear of moving is perhaps the most humiliating kind a military superpower can experience. But to understand why the Donbass sky now carries such heavy silence, we must look at the name that has the entire Russian military system in this area trembling: Lasar's group. A small unit almost unknown to most of the world until late 2025, yet powerful enough to reverse the rhythm of an entire battlefield that Moscow once believed was its absolute stronghold. Not an armored division, not an artillery brigade, not anything that fits the boastful speeches the Kremlin has repeated for years. Lasar is a combat UAV unit of the National Guard of Ukraine, so small that on an organizational chart it might look like a mere support specialty team. But in reality, they are one of the most terrifying spearheads Ukraine possesses. Behind this entire special structure is one man to whom the Donbass battlefield has given a nickname, not for media embellishment, but for sheer overwhelming effectiveness: Pavlo Yelizarov, or as the soldiers commonly call him, Lasar. That name is not symbolic, it is a warning. In October 2025, when fighting in Donetsk Oblast entered an intense phase, Forbes suddenly published an analysis profile that few had expected would be devoted to a semi-independent UAV unit. In less than 2 years, Lasar's group had contributed to the destruction of Russian equipment worth approximately $12 billion. The tanks Russia once bragged about, the radar systems once promoted as an iron shield, the supply convoys the Russian Ministry of Defense described as unbreakable, all were recorded in the list of neutralized targets. Then by January 2026, Army Inform and reports from the National Guard of Ukraine updated that figure to over $15 billion. And this is not rumor spreading on forums. These are figures drawn from battlefield reports, reconnaissance data, UAV footage, and independent assessments provided by Ukraine to Western partners. These very numbers startled analysts in Washington, not because of Russia's losses, but because of the opposite. The cost to achieve this result is unbelievably low. A unit without proprietary technology, without a massive budget, without thousands of personnel, yet capable of inflicting damage comparable to a large-scale air campaign. That makes Lasar's group the perfect example of a new paradox in modern warfare. You don't need a superior force to turn the battlefield. You just need a unit that knows how to strike the right place at the right time. While Russia continues pouring tanks, armor, and self-propelled guns into Donbass in hopes of offsetting losses with quantity, Lasar takes the exact opposite approach. Instead of seeking direct confrontation, they strike the one element every military system depends on: mobility. A cheap UAV only needs a few minutes to turn $1 million convoy into a twisted heap of aluminum. A supply formation only needs to be exposed once to lose days restoring morale. And for Lasar, every strike is not just the destruction of a target, but a cut into the operational capability of an entire army. That is why they have become so dangerous. And that is also why this name, a name that never appeared in international media before 2025, is now spoken with caution in Moscow. The damage figures only explain part of why the name Lasar has become an obsession for the Russian army. The rest lies in how this unit selects its targets. While most UAV units on the Ukrainian battlefield focus on hunting tanks, ammunition depots, or fire positions, high-value destruction targets that require favorable timing, Lasar's group follows a completely different doctrine. They don't strike equipment, they strike movement. Every military system, no matter how powerful, exists thanks to its ability to maneuver. And that is precisely the vital point Lasar targets. On the dirt roads around Lyman, the temporary staging areas near Kreminna, and the northern Donetsk Oblast transit points, their reconnaissance UAVs often hover for hours, observing not to find big targets, but to record the rhythm of movement, when supply vehicles leave bunkers, when armored vehicles start engines, when medical teams depart positions. They study habits more than objects. When a convoy begins to roll, not when it charges into combat, but the very moment it leaves a safe position, Lasar launches the strike. That is when the enemy is most vulnerable. Hatches open, formation not yet stabilized, soldiers still dispersed, combat systems not yet activated. A strike at the right moment carries far greater tactical weight than a strike on target alone. And it is precisely this striking at the moment rather than at the target point that has made Lasar a very different kind of hunter in the Donbass sky. This difference creates terrifying psychological effects. When an armored vehicle is destroyed, the instant it edges out of cover, the entire formation behind it immediately halts. No one wants to become the next target in a pre-established chain of observation. A single explosion is enough to freeze the entire mobility flow of a company, even an entire axis of advance. On the Donbass ground, Lasar doesn't need continuous attacks to exert pressure. They only need to appear at the right moment to remind the Russians that every daytime movement can be seen, tracked, and hit. This not only collapses campaign timelines, but makes resupply operations already difficult in modern war, nearly impossible during daylight. Ammunition trucks must wait for nightfall. Fuel convoys must be broken into single vehicles. Medical teams are forced to retreat along winding detours, prolonging the golden hour for saving the wounded. That is why Lasar's power is not measured by the number of UAVs, but by the hours the enemy dares not move. A cheap drone can destroy one vehicle, but a vehicle destroyed at the right moment can paralyze an entire unit. And when that happens repeatedly along Donbass's main supply axis, daytime movement ceases to be an option and becomes a game of chance. No Russian officer wants to gamble their unit's lives on. What happened on the Donbass battlefield at the end of 2025 clearly shows that Lasar's doctrine of striking movement was not a theoretical idea, but a process implemented with near absolute precision. One of the clearest pieces of evidence came from the Lyman area, where a nighttime operation at the end of 2025 became a topic of discussion in numerous Western intelligence reports. It was not a large-scale battle, with no heavy artillery barrages or simultaneous assault thrusts. Yet within just a few hours, Lasar's group's attack UAVs sequentially neutralized around 10 Russian armored vehicles along with support assets. For an army as mechanized as Russia's, that number is not a minor loss. It is a direct blow to the ability to sustain offensive tempo. And what was even more terrifying was the way those targets were destroyed. Not while they were engaged in combat, but just as they left assembly points in the darkness, at the very moment when, according to military theory, the risk of attack should have been lowest. But Donbass no longer operates according to old theory. In another sector of the Donetsk direction, a separate incident further solidified Lasar's status as a tactical ghost. According to records published by Militani, one of the group's UAVs destroyed a buck launcher, one of the air defense assets Russia still regards as a vital layer of protection against aerial threats. If a multi-million-dollar air defense platform can be knocked out of the battlefield by a UAV hundreds of times cheaper, it is not just financial damage, it is a strike at the operational confidence of the entire system. These examples also clearly reveal Lasar's priority targets, supply vehicles, because without logistics, every combat unit becomes useless. Air defense, because creating gaps in the sky allows UAVs to operate more freely, and command vehicles, because even a formation with tanks and troops, if deprived of command, becomes nothing more than chaotic metal. Each of these target types inflicts not only immediate losses, but also cascading effects. A destroyed supply convoy can leave an entire forward battalion without ammunition. A downed air defense launcher forces an entire area to huddle defensively. A neutralized command vehicle brings all offensive plans to a halt. That is why, after each strike, Russian maneuver activity in those areas dropped sharply in ways measurable through satellite imagery and reconnaissance reports. Russian vehicles began moving in smaller groups, more cautiously, usually only at night and over the shortest possible distances. Yet even then, they could not escape what Lasar was building, an extended danger zone where the enemy never knows where a UAV is loitering, who it is watching, or when it will strike. Without needing constant presence, Lasar only has to appear selectively, and it is precisely that unpredictability that has caused an entire front to shrink back. When the Russian army can no longer feel safe even for a few minutes after starting to move, all their numerical advantages become meaningless. In modern warfare, it is not the side with more vehicles that wins. It is the side that makes the enemy most afraid every time they have to start an engine. And in Donbass, the one achieving that is Lasar. That effectiveness leads us to the crucial question. What makes a small unit like Lasar's group far outperform many other UAV forces operating on the same battlefield? The answer does not lie in the number of drones they possess. In fact, they do not have a larger UAV formation than other brigades. Nor does it lie in technology. There is no evidence they are equipped with superior platforms, secret UAV models, or cutting-edge communication systems that the rest of Ukraine lacks. Their strength lies in how they operate. A closed, compact, fast, and precise combat cycle that leaves the enemy no time to adapt. In their model, reconnaissance is not separated from attack, and attack is not separated from battle damage assessment. Every drone loitering overhead is not just recording footage, It is laying the groundwork for a combat decision that can be made in tens of seconds, not minutes or hours, as in many traditional UAV units. It is this decision-making speed, closer to instinctive reflexes than to standard military procedures, that makes Lasar exceptionally dangerous. While conventional UAV units focus on destroying targets, Lasar pursues a higher tactical value, paralyzing entire areas. A destroyed convoy is a loss, but an area where the enemy dares not move is a campaign-level strike. That is why, while other UAV forces can inflict heavy damage, yet fail to alter battlefield tempo, Lasar can stall an entire Russian axis of advance with just a few well-timed strikes. In modern military language, they are called a force multiplier, a small force capable of amplifying power far beyond its actual scale. What NATO and US military academies have taught for decades, that decision speed, information accuracy, and striking critical nodes matter more than sheer firepower, is demonstrated by Lasar at near prototype level. And that is precisely what sets them apart. They do not need air superiority, superior weapons, or large numbers. They only need to know the enemy's timing and vulnerabilities. For Russia, which operates on the philosophy of quantity push, this approach devastates more than any bomb or missile ever could. Because ammunition depots can be replenished, tanks can be replaced, but an army that has lost faith in its own ability to move is extremely difficult to recover. And that is what Lasar inflicts. They do not shoot more, they shoot better. They do not seek to annihilate entire enemy formations. They only need to make the enemy stop. And when the enemy stops, the battlefield inevitably tilts toward Ukraine. From here, Lasar's strategic impact becomes clear. When an army like Russia dares not maneuver, every pillar of their operations begins to crack in a chain reaction. Advanced speed drops to levels that even cautious Western experts describe as hard to slow any further, because an offensive thrust cannot maintain pace when every wheel turn carries the risk of being targeted by a UAV. Logistics are disrupted, as ammunition, fuel, and food convoys cannot move at the required tempo. Instead of the original Russian plan's 6 and 8 hour cycles, many routes now take double or triple the time just to ensure minimal safety. And most seriously of all, troop morale erodes, because nothing wears down fighting spirit faster than the feeling that death can come simply because you started the engine at the moment a UAV was looking down. That is how Lasar's group participates in the larger picture of the war without needing massive manpower or superior equipment. Lasar does not decide the entire war, no single unit can in a conflict of this scale, but they shape how the war operates. They create a new tactical environment where movement becomes a high-risk decision, where supply lines become a constant source of anxiety, and where Russian companies must rearrange their entire schedules just to avoid the periods they believe Ukrainian UAVs are most active. And at the strategic level, this matters no less than any weapon the West supplies to Kyiv, because from the US perspective, Lasar represents a striking reality. America does not need to deploy a single soldier, does not engage in any direct confrontation with Russia, yet Russian military capability is still being continuously eroded. What Washington, London, and Brussels are observing is not just material losses, it is the emergence of a systemic vulnerability. Russia cannot adapt quickly to the dynamic, asymmetric, and dispersed style of warfare that Ukraine is conducting. In NATO doctrinal documents dating back to the 1990s, one concept is repeatedly mentioned. To win in modern warfare, you must control the low sky, the airspace from the ground up to a few hundred meters, where UAVs, small helicopters, and electronic reconnaissance operate. Lasar is the most vivid living proof of that principle. They do not need to control the sky in the traditional sense like an air force. They only need to make the enemy believe that the sky always has eyes. And when the enemy believes that, the battlefield belongs to you. This is precisely why US military academies are paying special attention to the rise of UAV units like Lasar. They are changing the mathematics of war. Instead of asking who has more tanks, the question now becomes who can move more safely. Instead of asking who has longer-range artillery, the focus is now who sees whom first. In Donbass, the answer always tilts toward Lasar, and with each passing day, Moscow is forced to pay the price for its slow adaptation. Because once a small unit can lock down an entire axis of advance, the issue is no longer about firepower but about operational philosophy. And that is a war Russia was never prepared to face. And so, when all the pieces are put together, a picture emerges. Lasar does not just destroy Russian equipment, they destroy the sense of safety that any army needs to maintain in order to function. The damage figures from armored vehicles to air defense launchers are only the tip of the iceberg. The submerged, far more dangerous part is the gradual psychological erosion. Because in reality, Russia still has troops. Russia still has tanks, armored vehicles, self-propelled guns, large ammunition reserves, and an almost inexhaustible source of mobilization. But all of that exists only on paper if units do not dare bring it out of shelter. An army possessing thousands of vehicles yet forced to wait until night to move in small groups is no different from an army imprisoned in its own occupied territory. And that is exactly what is happening in Donbass. when Russian officers have to calculate every minute to avoid the Ukrainian UAV window, when every supply convoy must pray that it has not yet entered the observation range of a loitering reconnaissance device, then the war is no longer about how many targets are destroyed, but about who controls the battlefield tempo. Right now, that tempo is not decided by Moscow. It is decided by a small Ukrainian UAV group that the West once knew very little about but now cannot ignore, Lasar's group. And from here, the long-term significance begins to become clear. Donbass, long seen as a prolonged strategic wound, is becoming the model for a new kind of warfare, a war in which the low sky matters more than the high sky, where cheap UAVs defeat multi-million-dollar tanks, where flexibility defeats quantity, and where small but effective units can break the entire plan of a military superpower. For an American audience, this is not just instructive, it is a reminder for US defense policy. This is not a war that Washington funds to sustain a distant conflict. This is the biggest tactical laboratory of the century, where every dollar of support is generating strategic outcomes far exceeding the cost. When a Ukrainian UAV unit can inflict billions of dollars in damage on Russia without a single American soldier present, it proves that aid to Kiev is not charity, but a high-yield investment in maintaining an international order favorable to the United States. For the Pentagon, Lasar is not just a battlefield story. They are proof that a small nation can force a larger adversary to change the way it fights, to break formations into smaller pieces, to accept higher risks just to maintain minimal operations. And the Kremlin understands this very well. Putin can order attacks. Russian generals can claim progress. But when convoys still stand idle for hours out of fear of a buzzing sound from above, all victory declarations become meaningless. Because time, the factor Moscow believed it had in abundance, no longer stands on Russia's side. In Donbass, every passing minute is evidence of the shifting balance. Every moment of hesitation by a Russian convoy is a small Ukrainian victory. And in the low sky, where a single UAV can alter an entire offensive plan, the tempo bears the name Lasar. That is why Donbass is silent, not because there is no more fighting, but because one side is afraid to take a step. And when that fear belongs to the aggressor, while the battlefield rhythm belongs to those defending their own sky, you know which side this war is tilting toward. If you want to continue following battlefield analyses like this, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. What is happening in Donbass right now is only the beginning of a much larger story.